Okay, I want to make an addendum here and go back and clean up some stuff that I didn't get around to sort of expanding on that I sort of mentioned. So, uh, this issue about the blood and about it being a mesmerizing mystery, and I was trying to sort of develop um, some ways of unpacking the elements of this mystery because it's sort of I do think I found a resolution to it. I don't know if I should blurt it out now and then go back and then sort of redress this whole topic, which is basically I believe that what at least is encapsulated within the Christian method ultimately is that you end up having to have two law systems. You have to have something like the divine law, God's law, and you end up having to have a kind of secular law. And you almost have to realize that both are going to be incompatible. That there are going to be elements of the divine law that are going to wish to contradict the secular law, and then there are going to be elements of the secular law that are going to be permissible. Certain things are going to in secular law going to be permissible, which are restricted in the divine law, but there are also going to be some, let's say, duties in the divine law that are going to be illegal within the secular law. And getting to grips with this contradiction, um, I think essentially is that one also has to, if one breaks the secular law, if it has a certain kind of structure to it, I think that the penalty of the secular law should be imposed against someone who was trying to fulfill God's law. And I think that this is essentially what also the example of Jesus Christ crucified on the cross is essentially that you can't expect justice, worldly justice, is not going to um, is going to find fault uh, with even divine fulfillment of the law, as it were. So, I, but anyway, I'm getting really ahead of myself. So I was trying to talk about the mystery of blood, as it were, and let's say the spiritual problem of blood, and talking about it in that that it's one of these mesmerizing mysteries, which is essentially very dangerous because you have to exceed a blood narrative. If you fall into a blood narrative, um, I think that this is probably I don't know which I is probably going to be a worshipper of Balaam or something like that. But anyway, it's I do think that the understanding of blood in spiritual philosophy, I think, is somewhat comes down through Abraham. Abraham came from Sumer. He came from one of these cultures that understood blood magic, and I think that within their blood magic and within their metaphysics and philosophy, they actually saw the whole scope of these things. And Abraham sort of saw the end of that paradigm and saw that there was a one true God, and sort of then went and made his own name, or left that abracadabra. Abra became Abraham. That's the story of Abraham. Um, Changed the character of that spiritual lineage, as it were, by a kind of novation. Um, anyway, but now, and this is also explicitly in what Abraham is. The story of Abraham, the most important one, is obviously the would he sacrifice his own blood, his own son, for God. The willingness to sacrifice blood for God. that there is a truth that is higher than the blood, as it were. Um, okay, so the so the reason why I said, like, you have to consider that, like, even Jesus Christ came by blood, and I was trying to get into this mystery and to explore this by explaining that you have to think that Jesus Christ also made mistakes, that he could have killed someone, that he had spiritual blood on his hands, and in some sense, everyone in this sense always has spiritual blood on their hands. Because why was he the Christ? Why did the blood somewhat fatalistically uh, 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 in the fatalism ordained by the blood narrative, why was he the Messiah and somebody else wasn't the Messiah? Because if somebody else was the Messiah, then their soul would have been more honored and more secured, and or something like that. But it was him and not them. So he has spiritual blood on his hands just from the paradigm of a blood narrative. Everyone has spiritual blood on their hands in this sense, because it's a kind of, any narrative becomes a kind of zero-sum game, right? So the thing is that, like, how do you exceed a narrative? How do you get over that kind of hypothetical fantasy, which is very easy to construct? And I think you have to actually you have to do it by constructing an ultimate narrative and then breaking it. It's very, very tricky. This is a very tricky sort of internal thing to do, but I think that essentially you have to almost cynically and perhaps knowingly, you have to try to construct the best understanding you can of what the knowledge narrative is, but then you don't accede to the knowledge of good and evil as dictated by the narrative. You exceed it by having some greater understanding in some sense. And in some sense, you understand that all narratives will be fundamentally self-defeating in spiritual terms, because they will only ask for maximization and enslavement, and so they will provide maximization at the cost of enslavement. And do you have the ability? And this is the issue with the law itself, is that the divine law is capable of doing a lot more, because it's also capable of forgiving. It has this bespoke capacity where it can give accordance to things. It can precipitate a sin that is not unto death. That it can pray for sins and that they will not be unto death. It can transmute the dead into the living. It can redeem. It has this divine power. Secularity can't do these things, because if it does, it just develops a paradox, because it's bound to a narrative. So the worldly law and justice has to, in some sense, be a bit of a, because it's not capable of commuting a sentence. It's not able, in certain sentences it can't commute in certain frameworks. Um, you know the look. It's not as if the law can't have the secular law can't have some elements of mercy in it, but that mercy is somewhat bound to the narrative to some degree. It's not um, the criteria that it's going to use in order to ameliorate its own harshness is going to be a different set of criteria, is going to be somewhat bound and limited. Um, okay, so what's the other? Sorry, I'll have to address this in a future. I'll have to clear this up in the future. But let me move on to a better construction of this thesis. So when I say that you have to consider that Jesus Christ already had spiritual blood on his hands, um, the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." I was trying to, when I say he has spiritual blood on his hands, as in he's a killer in some sense. I wanted to explore the content of thou shalt not kill. What does it mean, thou shalt not kill? It does not say you will not kill. It doesn't say, sort of that you are destined not to kill. It says that your will should not kill. That's what I take shall to mean. Shall is a combination of what you will and what you should will. So the onus is on your motivation. The onus is on how you contend your will. This is the difference between sort of murder and homicide. That murder is that you intend to kill someone, or actually, let me not say murder. Let me say I want to make a distinction between killing where you are morally culpable for it and killing where you're not morally culpable for it. You can, um, you could do something that's not even a mistake that could lead to somebody else's death, and you could causally say that you caused their death, but there's no there's no culpability. Um, I'm just trying to think of a stupid example. Like somebody else could have set up a mirage. Somebody else could have set up a tripwire, and sort of you snagged the tripwire, which was an invisible sort of piece of fish string, and it was connected to a whole mechanism of butchery that sort of like imagine sort of some kind of diabolical Saw movie where you literally triggered the death of somebody else, but obviously somebody else set it all up. So obviously you're not culpable for that, even though you physically caused it in some kind of mechanical way, but you're not morally responsible for it because somebody else essentially designed that and perpetrated it. It was not, but that those types of triggers are simply not within the realm of within one's motivational scope. Um, it's they were nowhere connected to your will, to your motivation to cause those acts. Obviously, this gets slightly tricky when you're dealing with negligence or omissions. When you have a duty to look after something, and then you essentially are incredibly reckless or negligent, then you could argue that your will was sufficiently reckless or negligent that you are culpable for, um, let's say, the reasonable expectation um, that being negligent in that way would lead to that kind of harm. Okay, so the thing that you have to locate within narratives, which is always what is dissolved by the narrative, is the integrity of the individual consciousness. And you really have to, I mean, this is why in jurisprudence, why in mens rea, intention, the intentionality that went along with the act, the condition of the mind, that's what mens rea means, is, the guilty mind. Um, it's a condition of the mind, and it's a quality of the mind, and it's features of the mind that have to be understood in some sense, and that the should in some sense relates to their own internal reasoning, that they should have had a reasonable idea about what they should do, and that they were expected that they should do, which they didn't do. It's the should. It's inside the mind. They have this idea that their will should have done something that it was not responsive to, and that is the thing that shall not kill, not the hand, not the foot that triggers the tripwire, no, that triggers some diabolical mechanism. The mechanism doesn't. The mechanism is the narrative. The mechanism is already there, always there. The narrative is always set up. Now you see, if you can't disassociate yourself from the narrative as an individual consciousness, if you are embedded in the narrative fundamentally, then you are conditioned by it, and you are enslaved by it, and you are a beast according to it, to its conditioning and its imprint. So you lose your own humanity if you believe that the narrative is essentially the level of analysis or the level of objective knowledge and operation. Because if you have such a total narrative, then it's going to render to you a knowledge of good and a knowledge of evil, and then you are, I would argue that you are spiritually dead at that point, fundamentally. And the only way to come back to spiritual life is to border yourself, or to make yourself distinct. A discerning individual first has to discern where they begin and the world ends, or they end and the world begins. And I do think that you have to know both of those things. You have to, in the same way that you have to know your own internal moral law, as it were, or some kind of an integration and integrity that you could argue as some kind of status, as some kind of the fulfillment of the divine law, perhaps. And then you also have to understand secular law, I think. And you have to somewhat reconcile these two, because if you don't, then you're going to either be imposing a unilateral theocracy from your own subjective perspective, or you're going to be under the dominion of some worldly thing that you have to become a part of as some kind of sort of mafia syndicate of dominion, so that you can sort of, and there are lots of different mafia syndicates and there are lots of different dominions in the world. There are lots of different groupthinks, and you do have to learn how to navigate them. And in some sense, I would say that this is, in the scripture, it says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And so when you're in somebody else's territory, and it is expected that you pay tribute, then you sort of, you pay tribute perhaps, but you don't obviously concede your own moral, divine, internal understanding. Hopefully the world does not expect that kind of illiberal supplication. Okay, so and let me just say that the divine law that I talk about as well, the proper domain for this is essentially the communion, is the church. This is something I've been thinking a lot about Islam and trying to work out also things about it, and I think that there's some interesting things in Islam, because I think that it is almost how you would construct the law within its most permissible ambit relative to a kind of spiritual blood narrative. And I think that the biggest problem that it kind of, as a picture of what is reasonable in terms of even contemplating the divine spiritual narrative, to get a narrative, because you do need perhaps a narrative in order to exceed that narrative in your understanding, so that you can have a proper integrated sort of tranquility. The problem that I see with it fundamentally is that it, to me, seems that the religious core within Islam is fundamentally a private thing. It's very, very private. And in some sense, it's so private that I wonder if it's even properly edified within the structure, which is, as far as I can see, Islam models itself as a kind of Unitarian church. And it will generally, I think, gravitate towards some kind of, or at least in terms of how it's been culturally developed, because I do think that there are scholarly arguments to have made that the character of the entire structure is perhaps quite a bit different from how it is generally practiced by various different schools and scholarship. Anyway, it's very tricky to even try to talk about Islam. It's very offensive to even mention it. Anyway, I'm not going to talk more about it, because I'm going to sort of But so the problem with the narratives as well is that they can bestow on people a false sense of sanctity, that you can just do the right thing. And then you cannot be wrong. That, sort of, it tends towards a kind of behaviorism, where, let's say, the bespoke dispensation which spirituality is and you can always conservatively maximize things for a whole society by essentially saying, well, we are being restrictive here because we are trying to control suboptimal social ills. It becomes a kind of utilitarian maximization, and sort of the means are justified by the ends. And in some sense, you end up being vindicated by the status of the collective and not by the individual constituent. Um, I guess I don't have this all worked out in terms of delineating it into very coherent and cogent lines of ways of navigating all the little issues here, but I think it's something like that the worldly justice, and fundamentally all narratives are worldly as well, gets you down into within some stricture or within some axiomatic sort of set of bounded axioms, is going to lead to essentially telling you what you can and what you cannot do according to that model. And something like the divine fulfillment of real spiritual law tells you what you may and what you may not do. And the criteria is not based on behavior, it's based on like a much more intellectual a much sort of broader paradigm. So it doesn't get bound by saying this behavior and that behavior. It's more general. Um, and so that can lead you into saying that you may do things that you cannot do according to the worldly construct, as it were. And I don't think that you can ever try to merge these two. I don't think that you can have a successful theocracy, because the secular law, as it were, because, well, first of all, the divine fulfillment of the spiritual law is not something that can just be illustrated or imparted as a it can't be reduced, to a stricture, to a knowledge. It is basically only an understanding that can sort of be exemplified and modeled as a kind of in its embodiment, but not in neat depictions of it. Um, so there's a fundamental disjuncture there. Um, anyway, the reason why a blood narrative sort of is particularly um, deleterious or insidious is because the blood is a witness of the spirit. And I tried to make this point where, sort of, you just have to be burdened by it. You just have to sort of take it on. Um, because essentially to say, well, I wish I had somebody else's blood, I wish I had somebody else's fatalism or something like that, is essentially a hypothetical window or fantasy or imagination that is allowing you to sort of body snatch, or allowing you to and essentially reconstruing the world in such a way in which anyone could be anybody else or something like that, as a kind of imaginary body snatching or sort of blood switcheroo or something like that. Like, to do that is even to think about the world from the perspective of a God's eye perspective. You are giving to yourself, looking at the world through a single eye, of through God's eye, and a God's eye point of view. So you are taking on this objective truth paradigm, um, in that hypothetical generalization of sort of saying, well, everyone's blood should be like everybody else's blood or something like that. And because the blood is a witness to the spirit, it then gives you a way to hypothetically trap and hold captive and hold ransom all the spiritual things that exist. So you say, no, I should have inherited a different fate. I should have inherited a different birthright. And it says in the Christian scripture that flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom, but blood is a witness to the spirit, and you just have to put up with it. You just have to uh, tolerate it. And it's not confining yourself to your own blood. Uh, in some sense, I think is you can exceed the narrative by not trying to dispel a narrative, but trying to sort of cynically bastardize it or show its own paradox by exceeding it, by saying, okay, well, I have spiritual blood on my hands, therefore, and we all have spiritual blood on our hands. And in some sense, that spiritual blood that you have in your hands is a kind of sort of infinite amount, or it's inversely proportion to sort of the noble the nobility that your particular fatalism, that your preordained narrative contrived fate holds for you. And so you could say that, well, nobility has an inverse correlate with a kind of spiritual duty or responsibility um, that comes with an exact matching weight of spiritual blood. This is also going to be somewhat relevant when I start talking about the field circuits and my description of cognitive axes, which are a lot more complicated. But there are formulas that I've constructed, or that I'm busy sort of looking at, which are certainly very interesting, which will do with what I would call a kind of metaphysical emotional control, self-control and self-mastery, a kind of metagram. I think that there's a fundamental sort of self-mastery which can be extracted from metagram theory, from understanding the field circuits and essentially from cognitive axes and how cognitive functions relate to sort of stylistic thinking styles and disposition, and how these styles commingle with each other and essentially translate into one another or convert from or I'll have to come up with good terminology, but essentially there are all these mechanics where essentially some emotional tones lead to precipitating other emotional tones, and in order to and I do think that you have to basically balance these emotional tones, but in doing so you actually have to have quite a sophisticated metaphysical meta ethic which kind of shines out through doing these practices. So this is almost kind of like an emotional control practice which forces you to generate a kind of metaphysical, spiritual, religious philosophy about metaphysics and about consciousness, sort of will almost in a kind of behaviorist way will tend you towards developing those things, because you'll find out, well, the only way to sort of square these circles is to come up with these realizations, and so it will kind of precipitate particular kinds of realizations on the use or the context of these emotional tones or these cognitive functions. Um, and I've discovered new insights or mechanics, or at least I've more greatly digested it myself in looking at and studying through these diagrams that I've been constructing. That these different emotional tones, the negating emotional tones and the positive charged emotional tones, are each have their very particular place within what I've loosely been. I don't know if I'll stick with this, but I think that metagram could roughly be titled sort of archetypes, the constituents of archetype, sort of dispositional, emotional flows, or anyway. What else should I say? Okay, no, I think I've dealt with this issue. So yeah, I mean, I've just sort of gone back to my same old thing, having an internal locus of control rather than an external locus of control. But the reason why I brought up the emotional tone stuff is because the negating emotional tones, as far as I can see, I would loosely relate that concept of the negating emotional tones to judgment, and the positive charged emotional tones, I would loosely regard that to, like, you could call it positive energy flow or whatever. And the thing is that you need to have a balance of positive energy with judgment. And if you don't have both of those things, the whole thing sort of runs aground. Because the metagram circuitry, the field circuits, and how each of the emotional tones interrelate to the other emotional tones in strange ways, how these different cognitive axes, sort of share relationships with one another, there are inverse correlations in which something's negating emotional tone corresponds to something else, another field circuit's positive charged emotional tone. And so you end up having to, if you want to have a good positive flow of energy in one field circuit, you have to have a requisite amount of judgments coming from another circuit, or at least that is, or I mean, potentially you could have, you could try to have them all being positive without having the requisite judgment behind it. But then it's impossible for the field circuits to be integrated. So it takes a very special sort of impetus, or let's say meta ethic, in order to actually ground and circulate and have a kind of well functioning metagram anatomy of field circuits. Okay, so there's that. Yeah, I'm glad I mentioned that, but yeah, I'm very close to making my proper presentation on those things. Okay. This is another addendum which is really just focused on the very last point that I brought up about the negative emotional tone, or the negatory emotional tones and the positive charged emotional tones. I just wanted to point out that sort of I again, like, associating the negative emotional tones with judgment and the positive emotional tones with uh, I mean, in some sense, I would say that having sets or groups within field circuits of the positive emotional tones means that you have fluidity, means that you have a kind of, I mean, I think that this is actually best described in Scientology language. Scientology, I think, has language that probably uh, uh, from two different areas within Scientology pertains to the subject matter. Emotional flows, maybe to a slightly less degree, and emotional curves, um, I think would somewhat correspond to this kind of stuff, but also in but also just the basic concepts of having free theta. I think free theta would generally correspond to having positively charged emotional tones that are kind of in excess or in a surplus of a free circulation. Because essentially, if you have too many negatory emotional tones, then you don't have any free flowing overcharge or positively charged circulation within a field circuit. So I think ideally you want there to be more positive than negative in this sense, but you also can't have positive without negative, because there are inverse correspondences where some negatory emotional tones are are corresponded with positive emotional tones in other field circuits. So you can't just focus on just having positive emotional tones. You have to have judgment that backs it up. And this is essentially becomes the need for some kind of via negativa knowledge base. So I wanted to point that out, that you can't just, like, sort of be carried along by having all this positive emotional gesturing or something like that, that is, this free energy that is capable of constellating around something. Because if it ends up constellating around the wrong judgment or around the wrong negative emotional tone, which you can't just kind of get around by ignoring them, because it's part of the structure, it's part of the field circuits, it's part of how they interconnect with one another. So the idea that you can just kind of enjoy the materialism of the emotional tone energy, which I do think in spiritual philosophies, the metagram is generally should be regarded as essentially material energy, which is, I know that can seem conceptually strange because it's mental, but karma is mental. is all karma is mental karma. It's the consequence in thinking. It's not the consequence, some kind of fatalism or narrative of fatalism. That's a false understanding of karma. That's in some sense, that's how karma wants you to understand karma. That's not how the transcendental or self-realized self conceives of karma. But uh, but anyway, and also this is reflected in the Christian scripture even, when it more concretely defines, or in a more crystallized and very much clearer sense, where it actually explains that essentially what is worldly is, um, what makes something essentially fleshly and of the world is its temporal nature, which is a mental characteristic. Something's temporal status or nature is a condition or a tone in which the grammar of the mind um, uh, uh, conceives of the mental construct, or the um, and so how that is framed in terms of your time in relation to it. Obviously, the positive emotional tones, when in positive circulation and surplus, will render to one the energy surplus, or at least the energy latitude within which to choose to direct things in the present, because you'll have an excess surplus that you can flow out towards things in the present. The question is what is the style of that flow? Because just because you have a surplus doesn't mean that you're not a slave to whatever negatory structure is underneath that, even if that negatory structure is somewhat, it's in the it's dispersed amongst the narrative that you are implicitly plugged into, so just because you don't keep monitor or track of your own negatory emotional tones doesn't mean that you aren't being enslaved by them, and by, in some sense, perhaps the constructive cognitive dissonance between your positive flows of your differing field circuits are actually in a kind of fundamental incongruence in terms of their negatory sort of balancing. So there's a mechanistic balancing which is not being properly surveyed or purveyed or managed or administered by you, and that doesn't mean that then you're not sort of beholden to it, or it's not having an effect. Um, and I've got also ways of describing how this does have effects on essentially the metatype model of your personality, and so essentially how um, your sides of the mind are going to be in some kind of um, metaphysical disintegration, or there's going to be weak integration between the sides of the mind. But anyway, that's for my standalone presentation on metagram and metatype, which really is coming soon. Um, anyway.